associate professor at California State University, Fullerton, co-director of the Center of Sports Performance, director of the Biochemistry Molecular Exercise Physiology Lab, Dr. Andy Galpin.
Challenge and being really good for 30 days and then coming off the rails. And what are the long-term implications of that? What are the metabolic? We went through the endocrine system and all the data that is currently available. Yeah. Of course, we have way more that we still don't know, and there's lots of more research needed. But as of how it stands now, we went through all those things and discussed the implications. And really, if I could sum it up, it's a cautionary tale of intermittent dieting. So we want to generate for long-term sustained weight loss, or weight management, I should say, whether that's muscle gain or fat loss. It's just weight management, managing it however you want it to be at. So your control. We really need to think about creating long-term sustainable practices rather than, okay, I got to get ready for summer, or I'm going to get ready for this show, or I have this competition I have to cut weight for. And then crashing down, then coming off the rails, and how, ballooning up 20 or 30 pounds in between those things can really raise some significant havoc on the body and will continue to make that process much more difficult and oftentimes lead to very uncontrolled weight maintenance in the end. So that's really the distinction of that paper, is the intermittent dieting aspect.
Okay. And as for like the protocols and what maybe some practical implications of that are and how intermittent dieting compares to continuous dieting, does it seem to be a little bit more favorable for that long-term approach and maybe a little bit more efficient fat loss possibly?
Yeah, the continuous behavioral sustainable practice is far better than the kind of crash and burn, restart, yo-yo dieting. If you want, you can pull up the paper, or anyone can, and in that, Jackson has a whole host of very practical applications and things to do. And so I won't belabor the point here because you have to do some work on your own. But it is out there, and yeah, you're absolutely right. It's much more advantageous, even for somebody who, in my case, I work with a lot of weight class-based athletes. Lane and Eric, not necessarily, but they work with a lot of fitness and figure and competitors that have to, they're not in a weight class per se, but they still are crashing up and down on weight loss, weight gain numerous times throughout the year. And so from both perspectives, we tried to write the paper such that when we help people understand, it's probably not very good to go, 2 months of eating broccoli and chicken and then getting down to as lean as possible and then exploding out and eating pizza for a month. And then that effect is probably not very good. In fact, we would argue, and certainly if you've been paying attention to anything Brett Contreras is doing lately, he's been arguing the same thing too, is we don't even need that stringent diet to get on stage in the first place. So we don't have to do that to hit our goals. And certainly within the athletes I work with, we don't do anything like that to get them down. And we have some pretty extreme weight cuts. So that's really what the message we're trying to get out. And very specifically to not just make that message, because I could just say that or put that in a blog post, but to review the literature on that and to show all of the different physiological issues that have been documented with those yo-yo approaches. So it's not just our opinion, it's not just the weight loss, it's also the physiology that you're compromising because of that.
Right. And have you, with your work with athletes and intermittent dieting, have you found that it could potentially be a little bit more difficult, since I know a lot of those athletes might have like a time restraint of when they're competing and when they have to make weight? Do you find that, or does it just come down to planning a little bit more ahead of time, or how do you kind of approach that?
Well, I mean, yes, you're definitely right there. The more planning we can get, the more professional approach. We always tell them, you're a professional athlete 365 days a year, not 8 weeks. So to be a pro in and out of camp. But the reality of it is, especially, I'm fortunate enough to, most of the people I work with are at the highest level. So they're in the UFC. And then specifically, we just don't get notice all the time. Even headline guys, main event guys, sometimes things pop up and it's like, okay, I got to get it ready in 4 weeks. And so we try to just be diligent on the outset to check their weight in the off season. It's not like I try as best I can. It's not always possible. But when the fight is over, not to just be like, okay, see you. Let me know when you get another fight signed. I'll be back. Mm-hmm. I want to be working with them constantly throughout the year and checking in. Where's the weight at? If you fight at 155 pounds, are you all of a sudden it's been a month and you had hand surgery, or you got to repair your hamstring because it got torn off the bone or something, and all of a sudden you're 195. Like, oh shit. So I don't want it to get there. I want to catch you at 184, 185.
Right. So making sure to at least have a plan coming out of the fight and after the diet as well, for sure.
Yeah, there's a pretty famous story, or pseudo famous. I was fortunate to work with an athlete who won a gold medal at the Rio Olympics, and this was a very, very hard process in terms of getting the weight to where I wanted to be. It was really about 10 months we spent with that goal in mind, and she made the weight, and it was great, and she won, and she performed well, and she won a gold medal. And so if you kind of remember how the Olympics work, as soon as you get off those things, they kind of rush you to Good Morning America, and you do all these like shows, and you're barely even showered. Oftentimes you're still in your gear. And so they're rushing her off to do that, and they have her in the back doing her makeup and her hair and all this stuff, and they bring in pizza and chocolate and all this stuff. And I'm like, don't do this. I'm telling you. Like, don't do this. Go ahead, have a piece, like have a bite, but don't do what I think you're going to do right now, because trust me, you're going to be on Good Morning America live in front of 15 million people or whatever, and bad things are going to be happening in your stomach. And so she's like, okay. And then of course she got on there and just smashes the pizza and smashes the chocolate. And she's like, oh yeah, he just told me not to do this, but sorry, Andy. And they're like, what? And I'm like, oh boy. And of course, she paid the consequences. So,
yeah,
but
for sure.
We want to be. I guess my point of that whole story was really, even after the fight, immediately the day after, with my guys, even after they make weight specifically, they haven't fought yet. So in fitness and figure and things like that, your lowest point is when you're on stage. That's when you feel the worst. That's when you're most dehydrated. Well, in my sports, it's the opposite, right? So I still have to perform. So even after the weight cut is over, we can't now just be like, okay, great, and I'm going to go nuts, because 24 hours or 36 hours from now, you got to go fight for your life. So it's not over. And even after the fight is over, the next day, the next week, the next 2 weeks, it's not over, because sometimes we have some damage we have to repair. And so the analogy we always say is, a Sherpa is someone who guides you up the mountain, or at least that's what people think. But more people die coming down the mountain than going up it. And so a Sherpa is really somebody who guides you up the mountain, but also guides you back down safely. So that's the approach we want to take with this intermittent dieting thing. Is, I know there's going to be some binging, there's going to be some reward eating that you need to do, but let's make sure we can do it in a way that's the least amount damaging possible.
Right. And I think that's great, because I think I often see a lot of coaches will have this like 10-week diet plan or whatever it is. And it kind of builds this approach to where it's like, after these 10 weeks, it's cut the reins on their client. Okay, see ya. And then that's just not a great thing for long-term weight loss and management and things like that.
Yeah.
All right. So the next thing that I would like to kind of move on to is kind of more fiber type stuff. And throughout my undergraduate degree, we were kind of taught that there's type 1 fibers, type 2 fibers, and then kind of a small portion of type 2 X fibers. And kind of following some of your stuff, it sounds like there might be a little bit more of a spectrum there. So could you kind of explain this, if there's more of a spectrum and maybe some hybrid fibers and kind of what's going on there?
Yeah, sure. It really honestly depends on how nitpicky you want to get. If I'm being honest, most of the time when I teach the same thing that you were taught.
Okay.
Right, because it's just not worth getting into the extra stuff. It's not a huge part of class, these things. Now,
right.
in my graduate classes, and I'm teaching an advanced muscle class, well, now we're going to get into all the details, and we're going to get in the woods. And the kind of equivalent is, I mean, imagine that your aunt came up to you and asked you for exercise advice.
Right. I'm not going to get into fiber types with her.
You're not even going to get into like, the difference between a straight leg RDL and a bent leg RDL, and like you're not going to get into Jeffers. Like, you're just gonna be like, okay, yeah, grandma or auntie or whatever. Like, do some weights and do some cardio.
Let's start going on walks and stuff.
For sure, right? And then it's like, okay, then she gets more excited. She starts learning more. She starts asking more questions. You go, okay, well, really, there's different kinds of conditioning. There's different kinds of cardio. Oh, really? Okay. That's really what it comes down to. So, because this is something I fixate on in my research, I get all excited about it. But your teachers aren't wrong. In reality, what's probably most appropriate to think is, anytime you build a protein in your body, right, which is almost everything in your body, your hormones, your neurotransmitters, your cells, your immune bodies, your red blood cells, your hair, all of these are proteins. Well, in order to build a protein, you have to have a gene that can code for that protein. So humans have the ability to code for 3 separate fiber type proteins. The 3 that you mentioned, 1, 2A, and 2X. So we would call those pure. The distinction is, it's what we now know is a single muscle cell can be a composition of multiple of those types. And that's the differentiation. So again, it's kind of splitting hairs. Well, yeah, we have the ability to only code for 3 individual ones, but we can make up a fiber that is any part, any combination, any 3 of those. So you can do the math there, but with 3 possible fiber types, how many possible outcomes can you make? Well, you can make a one that's only type 1. So it's pure 100% type 1. You can make a pure 2A or pure 2X. So there's 3 different types. You could also make one that has some part type 1, some part type 2A. Okay, that'd be a hybrid. You can make one that's part 2A, part 2X. That'd be another hybrid. Or you can make one that is part 1, some part 2A, and some part 2A, 2X, which is a combination. And in fact, I don't even know if I've talked about this ever before, but we have some recent stuff coming out that I think you might actually be able to do some 1, 2X as well, which we didn't think was ever really possible. So the point being, your body is very specific and has the ability to do many things that will meet the demands being placed on it. And that's exactly what it will do. So yeah, you could have a combination of hybrids or pures. And typically, as a very general statement, the more untrained you are, the more of those non-differentiated hybrid fibers you get. The more trained you get, it doesn't really matter what type of training, but the more specific demands you're putting on your body, the more specific you will get. And so you will lose some of those go-between halfway house fibers, those hybrids, and turn more into those very type 1s or those 100% 2As or whatever they have to be. So that's the kind of global perspective of what happens.
Okay. And you mentioned training for them. So at this point, can we train for these specific like fiber types and cause changes in our fiber type kind of construction?
Yes, 100%. It will follow, as best we understand at this moment, how you train. So if you were to train in a more endurance-based, and I don't even think we have any evidence to suggest the specific type of endurance matters, but something that induces fatigue and that you sustain or you repeat several times, it's probably going to turn you more towards the slow twitch fibers because they are very fatigue resistant. So they're very good at handling fatigue. If you do the opposite, which is typically strength training, or any really form of it, you're probably going to increase, and well, this is actually very well established, you'll increase the amount of those 2A fibers. The 2X fibers, as a pure 2X, they are extremely rare in healthy people. The 2A, 2X hybrids are very common, but it is very, very rare to find a pure single fiber that is only 2X. So that doesn't really happen. So typically the anaerobic type of training increases to 2A, and the aerobic or more endurance increases the type 1. And you have pretty good flexibility within that about how much you can change and how quickly you can change, for sure.
And you mentioned how quickly. So on a time scale, like, are we talking like you could change from 60% type 1 to 80% type 2 in like the matter of 6 or 7 weeks? Or is it more so
no.
several months and months and months of training?
That type of transformation would take a lifetime.
Okay.
So
Gotcha.
You could probably more realistically, if you were say you had 20%, 25% 2A, 2X, and you went through 12 weeks of training. So you, instead of being at 25%, you might go down to 15%. And so the number of pure 2As would go from say 45% to maybe 52, 55% in 12 weeks. Now, that depends on how trained you are, though. So if you are super untrained, just like with strength, if you're untrained, you've never worked out before, your rate of increase of strength is really high, right? You add 5 pounds every week, which looks like you're getting stronger. Well, after a couple of years, it takes like a year to add 5 pounds of strength. And then after 15, 20 years of training, like you're struggling for a pound a year. Well, same thing with the fiber type. So if you are very trained, the rate of change is very, very slow because you're already very, very specified as it is. But if you're untrained, it actually happens very quick. In fact, on the other end of the spectrum, we have seen multiple reports now have shown fiber type can change in as little as 14 days when you become extremely inactive. So these are again extreme cases, like when we send the astronauts up into space and there's no gravity for 2 weeks, or you're in a cast and the muscle is literally immobilized, 100% immobilized for 10 days. Then we'll start to see changes in fiber type. So somewhere in that 2 weeks to 3 weeks is when it'll start being noticeable.
Okay, so it takes quite a while, and then there's going to be diminishing returns for the more trained you get. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Because there's in the context of building muscle, there's kind of a theory out there that every once in a while you should run a 4 to 6 week kind of strength phase and convert these fibers into more fast twitch, and then go back to your hypertrophy training and kind of cause them to grow a little bit more. And kind of based on what we just talked about, in a more trained athlete that knows about periodizing their program into a strength phase and stuff like that, I almost feel like that 4 to 6 week block might not be long enough to cause these adaptations. What do you think about that?
Well, hard for me to answer because that really comes down to context. Mm-hmm. So it depends on what type of athlete you are. It depends on what sport you're in. How many years have you been training? All those things change. I think probably as a very, very general statement, I think your suggestion is pretty good. Now, whether or not that changes fiber type a lot, I don't think it matters because I think the other benefits support the idea regardless. Mm. So would you see a change in fiber type? No, maybe. But also remember, just because we can't measure it or it doesn't become statistically significant in the laboratory, doesn't mean it's not happening. It just means it hasn't hit a certain threshold yet. Right. Right. And so could you cause a 1 or 2 to 3% change in the fiber type in that 6 weeks? Maybe. But that probably wouldn't be, quote unquote, statistically significant in the lab. But that doesn't mean it's not actually happening. It just means haven't hit that threshold yet. So I don't think it's a terrible idea. But again, it would be very dependent on the athlete and all the specifics. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think just for the sake of variation, like just doing sets of 8 to 12 year round can get pretty stale. And probably from even a fiber type, to keep your fibers nice and healthy, it might be a decent idea to kind of rotate between rep ranges. Do you think that's a decent idea?
Yeah, again, it depends on the goal. Are you training for hypertrophy or strength or just general fitness or health? What are you looking for? Mm-hmm. But yeah, if we're talking general population, this is perhaps one of the most important things we need to convey is how you need to, at least every once in a while, do something kind of heavy for those exact reasons, to preserve those fast twitch fibers. Because if they're not used, they die out, and they die out at a much faster rate as we age than the slow twitch ones. So you have no problem preserving those, but when you lose the fast twitch fibers with age, you're in big, big, big trouble. So from that perspective, it's different than a professional athlete or a 23-year-old college amateur bodybuilder or whatever.
Yeah, of course, it's as with everything, it's going to depend on context and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And something that I actually listened to your interview with Juma Iraqi on Iraqi Nutrition last night.
So didn't that just come out like 4 hours ago or something?
Hey, I had to make sure I stay prepared for this episode here.
Okay.
And something you mentioned was, and when you mentioned this, you made sure to add the context of this is speculation. This is complete, just an idea. And your idea was having a post-workout window for specific fiber types. Mm-hmm. So I'd be kind of interested in you going into a little bit more detail and why you might think that's the case.
Well, why I think that's the case is because our preliminary data from a study that we're running right now suggests that is the case.
Okay.
But it's prelim. It's not published yet. In the world of science, it doesn't count until it's published. And we haven't collected our full data set. So it's also possible it won't shake out that way when the data is complete. I think it will still. I've got enough sneaking suspicions to say it. But, if you look at the metabolic properties of the fibers, this is something you would have predicted. They're very different in many of these things. We know that, for example, fast twitch fibers are more responsive to strength training than slow twitch. And they carry more anabolic signaling windows. They're more saturated in signaling proteins and genes that code for muscle growth, where Soul rich fibers are more saturated for things like mitochondrial biogenesis and density. So from a metabolic perspective, it makes sense. We also know that the fast twitch fibers are much better at using carbohydrate or glucose for fuel, where the soul rich fibers are the opposite, more attuned at using fat. So I think from all those things, we combine this with the actual data that I'm staring at, and it says, well, I think this is maybe one of the reasons that explains why fast twitch fibers do respond in terms of a training outcome to things like strength training more than soul rich fibers. So we know what happens. We just haven't figured out exactly the mechanisms yet. And so to me, like, I'd honestly be sort of surprised if it wasn't. So with the post-exercise anabolic window thing, if these fast twitch fibers are growing more when confronted with the same stimulus than the slow twitch fibers, something has to be explaining it. And so perhaps they're more sensitive. Their time in which they are sensitive to intaking of nutrients like sugar, glucose, amino acids, then that would behoove them or help them with hypertrophy. So to me, like, I'm pretty confident that we're going to see something there, but no one's really ever asked that question before. So that's why we haven't ever seen it. Or no one's actually had the technical ability to measure it like we have. So I'm pretty confident we'll find something there.
Okay, cool. Because like you said, theoretically, I think it makes a lot of sense, but just haven't seen a lot on it thus far.
Well, yeah, again, no one's had the technology or capacity to be able to measure it.
Yeah, so. And something, Jorn Trammell, I had him on the podcast recently, and he's a protein researcher, and he said,
of course, he's fantastic.
Yeah, and something that he said he's really excited about is, like, we're starting to get new ways of measuring muscle protein synthesis in other tissues like bone and even in the brain and stuff like that. And he's really excited about kind of upcoming research looking at, well, maybe it turns into, hey, maybe we should have 5 grams of collagen at every meal or something like that to elevate bone protein synthesis.
Yeah. I mean, he's the man with that stuff. There's a small number of people in the world like Stu Phillips and Luke Van Loon, and he's no different, that are really, really understand that stuff to even on a much better level than I do. Where we differ is they tend to look at that protein synthesis, whether it's skeletal muscle, bone. And I look more at the molecular mechanisms that tell you to and kick off the protein synthesis. So if you want to think of it this way, growing muscle or growing tissue is a 3-part cascade. So step number 1 is there has to be some sort of stimulus or signal. This could be a metabolic stimulus. It could be a nutrient stimulus. It could be a contractile stimulus. So something has to be going at the cell and telling it to do something or challenging it somehow. So step 1, that message has to then be conveyed to the nucleus, and that would be signaling. And that's where I spend a lot of my time, is looking at these proteins that transmit the signal from outside the cell or in the cell to the nucleus that says, hey, we've been introduced with some amino acid, or we're low on amino acid, or the cell wall has been stretched and damaged due to trying to lift up too much heavy shit, whatever it happens to be. Once it's in the nucleus, now you're on step 2. So step 1, signaling protein. And step 2 is the expression of the genes. And so you effectively think of this way: the signaling proteins will go to the nucleus and tell it, hey, the cell wall has been damaged. I need you to replicate the genes that code for proteins that we build the cell wall out of. Right now, the cell wall is mostly fat, but just follow along, kind of getting it. Mm-hmm. And so, okay, great. The step 2 would then be to express those genes. And this is anyone who measures gene expression is going to be looking at there. And then step number 3 would be to then build that protein, and that is protein synthesis. So we have to signal. That's where I spend a lot of my time in. I have done a little bit of gene expression work, but not really my very specific area. And then, okay, you've expressed the gene. Now you actually need to build the protein or synthesize the protein. So take the available amino acids you have, put them together to make a polypeptide, make that polypeptide into a protein. That's what Stu and Luke and all those other folks really specialize in. So it's a nice complement to their data and their literature, trying to figure out. They want to see if the protein synthesis is actually happening, and then I want to go behind that and say, well, what caused that molecular?
Okay, cool. And kind of on the subject of fiber types and things like that, there's this idea of hyperplasia. So fiber type splitting and kind of increasing the number of muscle fibers. And some people say that it's not a thing. Some people argue it is a thing. So what are kind of your ideas on this topic?
Well, it's actually interesting. Cody Haun, Haun, you should have him on the podcast. Very, very, very good. Real good practitioner, but excellent young scientist. Just finished his PhD. He's done some really nice work recently out of Mike Roberts' lab. Also a fantastic person to pay attention to and follow. He and I were chatting yesterday, and we're probably going to write a paper about this because the nomenclature is a bit of an issue here. So hyperplasia means the growing of a new fiber, a muscle cell that way. But probably what's more realistically happening is what's called fiber splitting. So it's not that you form an entire new muscle fiber. You probably take one that currently exists and split it into two separate ones. And so it's kind of, my pun here, splitting hairs a little bit. But I mean, molecularly, it does matter. It is important. Cody's right. Those are fundamental differences. And so I think it would be tough to show hyperplasia happens in humans under normal circumstances, or really any mammal. That's a tough go, outside of course, during development, pre-puberty. So adults probably have very little actual hyperplasia. But fiber splitting, I think, is a lot more common than we think. It's still not explaining a huge percentage, and it still only probably happens under what we call extreme circumstances. So my colleague Kevin Murick just published a really nice review article on this week. Kevin, I think I just posted on my Instagram one of his recent papers, so you could find him there and go back. He's done a whole bunch of work in this area and published several studies on it, and he actually has pictures of fiber splitting. He has all kinds of images of it happening. So I think it's pretty arguable at this point that it happens. The only questions remain are, okay, what extent does it happen in humans? What are the circumstances? Is it heavy eccentric training? Is this something that happens over the course of a decade, or is this something that you could notice in 6 weeks? Those questions remain unresolved, but I think it's an advancement because when I was in school and still being taught in school is that it's 100% impossible. Mm-hmm. And that's just fundamentally not true. We just don't know exactly what role it's playing, how important it is. Is it explain 5% of hypertrophy? Is it explain 40% of it? No, 40% probably not. But I think 5 is maybe a reasonable guess. Over the course of a decade, maybe more. Because if you look at the literature on, there's only been a few studies, but the literature on high-level bodybuilders, they typically have, their muscle fibers are actually not that big. They just have way more of them. And so this doesn't prove hyperplasia or fiber type splitting because we don't know if they were just born with more fibers. And so they got good at bodybuilding because they had a lot more fiber. Right. And so the only way to answer this would be to biopsy count fibers, put somebody through 15 years of bodybuilding, and then biopsy them again. Yeah. Which is possible. It's totally possible, but it's very difficult. So, but given that stuff, we've seen it in animals extensively. We got pictures of it happening. When we do sort of extreme stuff, we typically notice bodybuilders and people who are lifetime heavy lifters have way more fibers. And so those two things combined make me think, I think fiber splitting is actually probably something that's happening with normal strength training. We just don't have the technology that's sensitive enough to be able to measure it at this time without some crazy intervention that will take 15 years. Okay, cool. And do you think that this is potentially a point in favor of muscle damage as a mechanism of hypertrophy? Because my audience is definitely familiar with the mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy, mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. But kind of recently, it's been more so muscle damage might be something that you want to limit as much as possible rather than be an additive to hypertrophy. So what's kind of your ideas on that? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Maybe not. The thing is, I don't know if muscle damage is a prerequisite for fiber splitting in the first place. So that's an assumption that I don't know it's true. Right. Seems to be extreme overload induces it. That's actually what Kevin's new paper shows, but what extreme overload exactly means? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, in the context of humans anyways. So I don't know. But yeah, it could be not. Right. We got to figure that assumption out first. And I think that it's probably a reasonable approach, I think anyways, is to maybe not go to the extreme to where you don't try to have any muscle damage whatsoever. And because if you do that, then I think that you're just kind of
avoiding overload in a lot of ways, and overload will probably inherently come with some muscle damage. But then again, you probably don't want to be on the other side of the extreme to where you're sore from every single session, and going into sessions, you're still sore and that sort of thing.
Yeah, agreed. I agree.
Cool. And kind of the next place I'd like to take this is more so along the lines of artificial intelligence and athlete monitoring and how that might play a role. Because you wrote a great book, Unplugged, and it was kind of more so on the technology side of things. And I'd be interested in kind of where you see this whole artificial intelligence playing a role in athlete monitoring and training programs and things like that in the future here.
Very big question. Obviously, if you look at the history of technology, it's typically been a good thing as far as we can measure. But we have to start thinking about, because so far we have been able to keep pace with technology as humans. So the increases in technological abilities have been such so that the pacing we can handle. But we're about to lose that. And that tipping point will happen, and we will not be able to keep up. Certainly the point of the book was to help people understand this from a fitness and health and training perspective. But, these things still come down to context. You still have to think. You have to use your brain, because those technologies don't do that for you. They don't understand the full scope. Artificial intelligence is only still as smart as the question you ask it. So that's what we have to really be careful. It's somebody is still programming that, at least initially, and something is telling it what to optimize for, or telling it what to train for, or telling it to train for something or to optimize for something. That fact alone is still an instruction. So we're in a good/bad place. Of course, my personal belief is, like many other types of technology, they will do a lot of good. There'll be a lot of help work, but I think it will actually add value back to the individual coach. There'll probably initially be a dip. Coaches and personal trainers, especially personal trainers, will get undervalued and probably even run out of a job here soon. But I think there will be a natural rebound past that, and that will make it huge leaps in the demand for personal strength coaches and healthcare providers and things like this, because people will want actual personal one-on-one attention from a real human that understands and the complexity and can interact and honestly just be there. There is a solemnness that happens when you train by yourself. It might be cool for a while, but eventually part of exercise is a social and communal action. And this is why CrossFit, for example, was so much more successful than a commercial global gym, because when you go to a typical gym, everyone has headphones on and there's 100 people in a room and nobody knows anybody else, and there's no communication except for, hey, can I work in? Well, CrossFit did the exact opposite, and they showed how important community is with exercise, and how everyone and how that can exacerbate goals, and you have much better long-term client retention if they don't get hurt. People come to the gym on Saturdays just to hang out. You're doing barbecues. Like, that would never happen at a 24-hour fitness. So that, I think, CrossFit certainly got that right, and I think that will play even more so. Like, you're going to want people to work out with you, you're going to want all these other things. So as much as the AI will get there, and you're still going to want someone to be there to lead and to show you and to be in front and to help you. The human interaction piece will be lost by the AI, and I think in several areas of our world, that's going to be just fine. I'm not concerned, honestly, to interact with people when I get my oil changed. I'm not too worried about losing that kind of interaction. But health, wealth, and exercise, or health, wealth, and relationships, we're not going to want to give that part up. So you're going to want people there for it.
Right. So you kind of see it swinging one way first, where it might devalue coaches and personal trainers and things like that. But then you think it's going to swing right back to where, okay, we still need this human interaction and this one-on-one attention here. And
I think it will actually swing back even further than it is now. Okay. It will. I think coaches and personal trainers will be making a shit ton of money after this. I think they're going to be extremely valuable. It'd be a very prestigious profession. You're going to also see, I'm telling you, I've worked with a lot of professional athletes. And if we had to, say, find a physical therapist, something was going on with an athlete, and I came and said, here's 2 physical therapists, pick which one you want. One of them has an IQ of 180 and has an IQ of 280, right? Genius is like 160. But let's say somehow this human could have a double genius level, but they've never worked with anybody. And this other guy has an IQ level of 70, but has 20 years experience doing exactly this rehab method with professional athletes like you. Well, you obviously know the answer there. Halfway through the scenario I gave you, you already knew where I was going, and you know the answer. So why do we think that's going to change? Intelligence won't be the thing that stops people. It would be experience. Have you done this before? Show me your track record. Oh, fantastic. Oh, you can do this with your own self. There's a certain feel in your hands you would get in this example. You would notice things. There's this intelligence that goes beyond intelligence. We call this wisdom. We call this experience, right? We call this coaching eye. These are unexplained types of intelligence, and people will gravitate towards that. And I don't ever see us leaving that. And the people that don't ever develop that skill set, because all they do is sit on their computer tracking GPS monitors, I don't think those people are going to be sought high after in 15 or 20 years. Well, some of them will, because that demand will be there. But a lot of people will be, coaching for quote unquote coaching for 10 years, and then realize they don't actually know how to coach,
right?
And they're going to get left behind. So.
Cool. And I'm in a sports psych class right now, and something that we're currently talking about that's big is having emotional intelligence with your clients and your athletes. And a great way for people to develop that is, luckily, as coaches in this field, a lot of us have played sports in the past, so we've kind of had that experience with others to kind of develop, okay, this personality might respond a little bit better to this. And I struggle seeing like artificial intelligence really being able to pin down that kind of emotional intelligence side of things. Yeah,
for sure. That's going to be potentially a big problem depending on how you're using it.
Yeah, for sure. And this kind of subject kind of relates to how to think critically and things like that. And you have a podcast, The Body of Knowledge, which I never hear anybody talking about it. And it kind of bothers me that people aren't bringing this up more, because it's honestly, if you want to learn better how to think and how to be a better coach and things like that, I'm not sure if there's a better resource out there. And one podcast episode in particular you had was with Lee Brown, a mentor of yours. And that hands down might be the best podcast like I've listened to. And a couple of the biggest takeaways I had from that podcast was that hard work, it's never wasted. And that doing the right thing always pays off. Always in the long run. So those are a couple of huge takeaways for me. If you could share any big takeaways that you've had, like it doesn't necessarily have to be from Lee Brown, but it could be just kind of coming up in this industry. If there's any advice you'd give to people that maybe be content providers or people trying to quote unquote make it in this industry, or any life lessons that you learned there from other mentors like that.
Yeah, I mean, that obviously was a pretty special episode. Having worked with Lee for several years, he's the one that hired me, brought me on, gave me a job. So that was fantastic. One of the reasons why you don't hear too much about our podcast is because we only put out episodes like once every 8 months or something. Right. I think it's probably actually been over a year since we've released an episode. So we do it in short seasons. It comes in batches, but it does very well. We get plenty of downloads and stuff. But that's been a fun venture, because the way that we approach that show is quite different. It's serial. We tell a story rather than weekly content or something like that. But from people like Lee, from my own experiences so far, several things I would tell people are two of the things that you mentioned. Hard work is never wasted. And just treat people right. I'm fortunate. One of the guys I work with at Cal State Fullerton is a very world-renowned sports psychologist. And he says this constantly in class when a student says or asks the question, do I need to know this? Do I have to read this? His response is always, I don't know. Come back in 10 years and tell me. And so, you just don't know what skill set you need to pick up. You have no idea what's going to end up being valuable or not being valuable. And another piece of advice I can give you related to that regarding social media is something I'm fortunate, honestly. I feel very, very fortunate that we didn't have social media when I was in college, because I was stupid. And I'm glad I didn't say, I said a lot of things that I'm really glad nobody has that on record. Mm-hmm. You're very, very opinionated when you're that age, and you don't have enough life experience. You don't have enough empathy and perspective to think about the impact of the things you're saying. So do that, and instead of jumping to conclusions and judging other people's stuff, put it out there. And I think I said this in one of the episodes of season 2 of our show, but I think it's much better to take things from the advantage that if you're not getting a break, if you're not making money, if whatever reason you're not getting things you want, it's 100% because you don't deserve them. And that's just it's a mentality we really need more people to take. That no one's watching your podcast. Well, because it sucks. Why? How do I know it sucks? Because no one's watching it. Like, no one's following your page because your page sucks. That's why. Like, no one's following. That's why. So I think far too many people use social media to try to get famous. And I give these examples all the time. Look at Brett Contreras. Look at Brad Schoenfeld. Look at Eric Cressy. Brett Bartholomew. You pick the person who you think is famous or you're trying to aspire to. And you know what? Not a fucking one of them got famous because of Instagram. Not one of them. They got famous because they continually put out really, really good content, but they didn't put a single thing out until they actually had expertise. Not, I did this 6-week training cycle one time. I've coached 13 people so far. I mean, Brad had 20 years of training experience. Go look at what Eric Cressy used to write on T Nation. Go look at the articles Brett Contreras put together 15 years ago and gave away for free. The hundreds of hours of research, the 4,000 word articles that had 35 references in them. The 10,000 clients he trained before he had a single post about the hip thrust. That's what we need. We don't need any more people talking about the thing they did for 6 weeks and it was really helpful. And all of a sudden you did your first weightlifting competition. Now you're ready for DMs for coaching. Or you did your first weight cut. Now you want to, we don't need any more of that. That's not helpful to people. Basically, shut the fuck up, develop expertise first, and then put it out there, because then you actually have talent. You actually have expertise. Then you're going to take off. Then people will care. But for now, you're just another guy or girl on Instagram trying to sell online personal training because you did one powerlifting competition. 2, 3, 4, right? That's not what we need. So that's my advice is, you're not an expert yet. And again, I want to say that with some humility because I didn't do those things either. I did not do that right. I should have been told the same advice. It had been like, oh yeah, you haven't done anything yet, Andy. There's a reason. Do something first, and then you'll get Twitter famous or whatever you want. But you got to do something first. So spend less time trying to create content and more time doing. Right. The reason Eric Cressy created such amazing articles in 2005 is because, again, he had trained 1,000 baseball players and he had actually solved this issue 55 times. And now he was confident taking a swing and going out and the thing. But you got to do the damn thing first. You have to have extreme success first. You got to be a real expertise. So I think content creators drive me more nuts than anything else. I mean, God, they drive me nuts. No, I don't need more content, buddy. I need more problem solved. Go do something, and then you can create your content. But that shit drives me insane.
Yeah, I can totally see to where a lot of people they look for that short term, that volatile spikes in viewership by posting, an ad picture with a little caption with how they did it and things like that. And I don't know. I think a lot of that stuff is going to just be a volatile spike to where those people, maybe they get the followers right now, but over time, if people look at their content, it's not going to do anything.
No, we've been through waves. I could even name names. I could tell you, I've been in this industry for a decent amount, not super long, but 20 years. I could tell you names of people who same thing happened and they're gone. They come in, they're gone, they get hot on something, right? But at this point, have your social media, whatever, if you want to, if you're young in the field, but you don't need to make any posts. Nothing. You can be there and follow people and stuff, but spend all that time you spend on Instagram, go training an athlete, go train a client, go build something, go do something first, get good success with it. Again, Brad Schoenfeld had 40 peer-reviewed publications before he had a single Facebook post. This is the stuff I'm talking about is the reason he took off and is a world-renowned expert in hypertrophy is because he's done now 50 studies on hypertrophy. Not because he's read somebody else's 50 studies. He's the guy doing them. That's the expert. Brett Contreras is trying. I can't even tell you how many people increased butt size. And Eric, you name your name, there's other people too. But they've actually done it not once, not twice. They've done it for 20 years with hundreds of thousands of people. And now you can go back and build your content. Now you can shoot YouTube videos and do things like that. So spend more time actually becoming good at what you're trying to sell that you're good at.
Yeah, I think there's such a message nowadays that you have to produce consistent content.
Bullshit.
And people hear that and then they just put out a bunch of garbage. And I've done it in the past. And then I was like, hey, why don't I just start a podcast to where I can actually talk to people that are experts and have more experience than I do and actually learn from them. And then maybe down the road, I can start putting out more and more of my own stuff.
Well, there's a reason we only release 5 to 8 episodes of our podcast every year.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm not going to put anything out there until I have something that's really valuable to say that we've really vetted and experienced and gone through, and we feel like it's really, really sharp. So we don't need any more podcasts, no offense, but like the world doesn't need any more of that.
Yep. I think you're 100% right. You know, being probably not the best thing to say as a podcast host, but you're right on this for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. So where can people find more of your stuff? I know bodyofknowledge.com, they can find a lot of stuff. Where else can they go?
Yeah, just my website, andygalpin.com. I take that on my YouTube video or my YouTube channel as well. And I have that all linked up through a Patreon account. And so the way that works is you can donate as little as you possibly want, $1, $2 or whatever. But I'm trying to effectively take all of my university lectures and put them all up on that page.
Oh, wow. So
if you want to take an undergrad ex-phys class with me or nutrition, or you want to take my strength conditioning class, you can basically take it. That's the goal. And it's free. So just to clarify that, it's free. It always will be free. If you are able in a position to contribute, whatever little you can, that's fantastic. If not, I get it. I was a broke college kid for 10 years. I was on food stamps for 15 years of my life, or probably more. So I understand. But if you can, it helps make that thing viable option. So that's up there, and social media, of course, just Dr. Andy Galpin. It's pretty easy to find.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, Dr. Galpin.
You got it, man. Good luck.
Thank you so much for checking this out. Make sure to go check out Dr. Galpin's stuff. Check out my stuff at ryanjsalmon.com, and I will see you in that next one.